Welcome to the Sleepy War Veteran. In this story, you will be taken in a beautiful documentary to take you on an adventure back into history. Please calm your mind and enjoy the story. Before we close this series, you'll hear the precise 5-second routine British instructors taught in 1916 to win a sniper duel. A quiet drill distilled from hundreds of lethal encounters and preserved in their training notes. While you're settling in, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing this history map itself across the globe. Now let's start with the amazing story. The First World War did not begin with snipers. It created them. In August 1914, armies moved in columns across open country, officers with field glasses riding beside them, bands still playing in some regiments. By winter, movement froze into lines. Trenches ran from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Two unbroken scars separated by a strip of ground so close that a quiet cough could be heard across it. The parapet, the forward wall of earth and sandbags, rose just high enough to hide a man crouching. Above that, daylight belonged to whoever could put an accurate shot through a gap the size of a playing card. The new specialists were not introduced with fanfare. They appeared as a silence where a voice had been, and a warning that lasted only as long as it took for a rumor to travel down a fire step. Germany took the lead first because it could. Pre-war hunting culture in the world's best optical houses, Zeiss, Goertz, Hensoldt, meant many soldiers already knew stalk, wind, and glass. Sporting rifles with telescopic sights were pressed into service early, and infantry units received scopes adapted to standard service rifles. In the quiet hours after Stand 2 at dawn, a German Jaeger might settle behind a loophole. An armored slit cut through a steel plate set into the parapet, rest his rifle on sandbags, and wait for the barest mistake. A cap lifted too high, the rim of a periscope catching the sun, steam from a mug of tea drifting above the trench line. The shot that followed was not loud. The space it left behind was. The Allied response began as improvisation. British and French infantry were sharp shooters only in the general sense. Good musketry, practiced rapid fire, iron sights. The first weeks in the trenches taught harder lessons. Units wired iron plates into their parapets and cut narrow-hinged flaps, loophole plates, so men could observe without sacrificing their whole head to a guess. Periscopes became as common as rifles. At Gallipoli, an Australian carpenter improvised the periscope rifle in 1915, rigging mirror sights and a remote trigger so a rifle could be aimed and fired from below the parapet. In France and Flanders, engineers made decoys, dummy heads of papier-mâché and wood, to draw fire, mark a sniper's line, and answer later from a different angle with a single, deliberate shot. Within months, every front had its own vocabulary. No man's land was not empty. It was threaded with shallow saps, listening posts pushed forward at night, and dotted with shell holes that became daytime hides. A sniper's plate meant safety from the neck down and danger at the eye. Mirage ceased to be a desert word. Through a scope, heat made the air ripples slant left or right, a visible wind that could bend a bullet's path at 300 yards. Men learned to read it in the same breath they learned to stop smoking by day. The ember of a cigarette was a bead on a wire for the patient opposite. By early 1915, Allied formations began to formalize the craft. Canadian battalions, drawing on hunting traditions from home, fielded some of the first highly effective counter-sniper teams on the Western Front. The Ross rifle, controversial in general service, proved capable of fine accuracy in trained hands, and its Warner and Swazi telescopic sight, ungainly in profile, nonetheless delivered magnification that mattered in a duel. French units experimented with various sighted Lebels and Berthier, and with armored loophole shields of their own design. British regiments started to track the quiet work of certain men who returned each evening with calm reports and a blank expression. Their notes would be the skeleton of doctrine. The duel itself compressed into a handful of decisions. A sniper's day centered on seconds, scary not in noise but in their weight. Exposed too long through a loophole while focusing on a map detail, and the opposite rifle, already pre-sighted on the slit, could end the matter. Linger on a glint, and you might never finish the look. The safe routine became ritual. Glass with a periscope first to mark shapes. Use a pinhole camera's logic to fix angles without showing skin. Lift the loophole's flap with the back of the hand, not the fingers. Keep the rifle already rested, the sling set, the cheek weld identical every time, so the reticle sat where it should without hunting for it. Fire was not taken, it was released, a breath shared with the trigger and the wind's small opinions. German technique forced refinements. Their best shots learned to sight on habit, lining up on places rather than on people. The spot where a trench mortar team always rested its tubes after dawn. The corner of a traversed bay where a runner cut left because the duckboard had broken to the right. The slit where a British observer liked to park his periscope a finger's width too high. They worked with partners, one on glass, one on rifle, counting seconds aloud in low voices, trading roles so the ice stayed fresh. When shells lifted in a barrage, they knew to watch the opposite parapet for the instinctive look, men checking damage, that came as predictably as rain after thunder. Those were the scary seconds. They decided life because they always arrived wrapped in habit. Allied counter-sniping matured in mid-1915. Observers replaced shiny lenses with dulled brass, taped the rims, and tied back cloth to break hard outlines. Hessian and netting turned helmets and shoulders into moving pieces of earth. The later word, ghillie, belonged to another war, but the principle, unmake the human shape, was already standard. Wire screens went in front of loopholes to catch reflections. Periscope discipline became a phrase. Never show a straight line could have been a proverb. It was a rule. Sound, too, mattered. The crack thump, the supersonic snap followed by the dull report, told trained ears direction and distance well enough to sketch a triangle in a notebook and close it by lunchtime. One man's name threads through the change. In 1916, Major H. Hesketh Pritchard, big game hunter turned officer, organized the British First Army School of Sniping, Observation and Scouting in France. He was not the only voice, but he was a clear one. He collected the tricks that worked, mirrors below the parapet to reflect the sky into suspected loopholes and catch a glint without lifting a head. Dummy heads moved on rods to provoke a shot and mark a line, firing through the smallest possible opening, and he wrote them in plain English that sergeants could teach and privates could remember. The school turned ability into method, and method into results. By the end of the year, British snipers had erased the early German advantage along long stretches of the front. Sniping did not live on marksmanship alone. It lived on patience that could be measured. A team might enter a hide before dawn, the loophole shut, the rifle already aligned on a chalked point on the inside of the plate. Hours would pass. The observer would work a small routine. Periscope scan by sectors, note wind on grass or drifting smoke, feel the barrel not with the palm, but with the back of the finger to judge if sun had warmed it, and check the sling's tension by touch. A runner would bring a message. The flap would not lift for it. Habit saved lives. Deviation spent them. On other fronts the pattern held, adjusted for terrain. At Gallipoli's ridges and gullies, movement meant death after sunrise. Snipers worked with the periscope rifle and the shortest exposures of the whole war. In the Alps, Austro-Hungarian and Italian sharpshooters learned to read wind in snow banners and to fire on breath held longer, because thin air changed even the rise and fall of a chest. In the East, long lines and open woods made field craft, approach and withdrawal, more important than plates and slits. Everywhere the same seconds ruled. Seconds to find, seconds to fix, and the 1 second when a decision had to be made about whether the shot in this light, with this drift, would hold on the far side of the gap. By late 1915 and into 1916, the quiet duel shaped the daytime rhythm of entire sectors. Infantry learned to live by snipers' clocks, stand to, then stillness, breakfast under cover. Working parties, after a trained eye had swept the opposite parapet and marked likely places with a private language in a pocket book. Artillery officers took advice from men who had spent their mornings staring at a single field of view. Ration parties waited for a nod they could not explain in words. Now, the best snipers were not feared only for their aim, they were listened to for their timing. Sniping also shaped what soldiers saw when they remembered the war. Veterans wrote less about heroics and more about habits. The man who always rolled his sleeve again even after orders to cover up. The corporal who cut a notch in a sandbag for his sling so it would sit the same way every afternoon. The runner who learned to walk bent not from fear but from practice because the loophole opposite was just high enough to demand it. The scary part, they said without saying it, was how quickly a simple routine, lift, look, lower, became a line between an ordinary day and a letter home. By the spring of 1916, sniping had become a profession on both sides. Courses ran behind the lines. Rifles were glassed and zeroed with care. Loophole plates were cut and numbered. Periscopes issued and tracked like rifles. The duel remained personal, but it belonged now to systems, schedules, range cards, notes, rather than to chance. In that shift lay the pattern for the rest of the war. Individual skill nested inside organization. And within that organization, the 5-second window when a man decided to expose, to aim, and to release remained constant. It was still the second that decided life, measured not in drama, but in how a hand lifted a flap and how a breath was held. Stand to at first light set the rhythm. Men along the line fixed bayonets and peered over parapets in shallow, practiced rises, confirming that the ground in front of them looked the same as it had at dusk. For a sniper team, that same half hour was work already begun. Their rifle, zeroed the previous afternoon, sling tension marked, cheek weld memorized, lay waiting on sandbags behind a steel loophole plate, a hinged slit cut narrow enough to hide a man's face, and just wide enough to let a reticle rest on a coin of daylight. An observer scanned with a periscope first, never glassing through the loophole without a reason. If anything had shifted, a dark seam where a revetment had been patched in the night, a new brush of camouflage where yesterday there had been bare timber. The pencil drew a small triangle on a pocket card, and the slit stayed shut until it was time to test a thought with a single breath and a single round. The equipment took shape quickly once armies understood the job. Germany's early advantage came from its optics and mounts. Standard Gewehr 98 rifles were fitted with 3x and 4x telescopes from Zeiss, Goertz, Hensoldt, and others. Often carried on-side or claw mounts that allowed stripper clip loading and kept iron sights usable if glass failed. Triggers were honed, not transformed. Barrels were selected for consistency rather than replaced. Across the wire, Allied answers matured month by month. British units fielded scoped short magazine Lee Enfields and, increasingly, the pattern 1914 Enfield in .303. Heavy, steady, well-suited to glass, with Aldis Brothers tubes or periscopic prism company sights on offset bases. Canadians made notable use of the Ross rifle as a precision platform when kept clean and paired with Warner and Swazi scopes. French battalions glassed Liebels and Berthier. Austro-Hungarian and Italian sharpshooters built accurate rigs around their service pieces. Everywhere, two truths held. Good glass mattered, and a rifle that returned to the same zero day after day mattered more. The hides themselves were engineered as carefully as the rifles. Loophole plates, thick steel squares set into parapets, wore shutters that opened in lines that did not catch sun. Wire mesh or gauze sat just in front of the slit to tame reflections. Some units built double loopholes, a decoy slit hung nearby to draw a shot, while the real opening stayed shut until the second the rifle fired. Periscopes allowed long, consequence-free looks. Mirror rigs below the parapet threw a patch of sky into suspected enemy slits so an observer could catch a glint without lifting his head. In sectors where ground allowed, forward boxes, small timbered nests, were pushed into shell holes in no man's land during darkness, their faces dressed with sacking and mud so they read as earth at dawn. Inside such places, space was measured in inches and discipline in seconds. Camouflage followed simple rules. Break the outline, dull the shine, make movement look like nothing at all. Helmets wore hessian and net, shoulders carried strips of sacking, faces took a dark veil or a smear of soot, and bright edges on scope bells were wrapped or painted. A length of gauze across the objective cut glare without blotting the view. Even the rifle's smell mattered. Oil chosen in rear areas revealed itself in front when a downwind sent a sweet trace through a slit. Teams learned to oil lightly, to wipe often, and to sit upwind of their own kit when they could choose. With tools came a method. The best teams worked in pairs. The observer, often the senior, kept glass moving on a schedule. Sector scan, mark, wait. Sector scan, compare, wait. He read mirage through the scope's field as a visible wind, slanting left or right, rising or flattening with sun. He watched grass and smoke for a second opinion. He marked distances in a private shorthand. Post 350, revetment 420, and whispered corrections when the rifle came to the slit. The shooter built a small world that did not change. Sling tension, butt position, cheek weld, eye relief set so the reticle floated in the same place every time the shutter went up. A breath in, a breath stopped, a release that felt like the same word spoken quietly each morning. In the duels that decided whether working parties lived through daylight, that kind of sameness beat everything else. Range and wind were solved with what a man could see and what he remembered. Early war telescopes carried simple cross wires with no built-in measure. Teams used known heights, the course of sandbags in a parapet, the breadth of a helmet rim, the width of a trench bay, against the apparent size through the glass to reckon distance, then confirmed it against tables they had copied by hand in training. Mirage showed drift. So did the slow lay of smoke from a brazier or the flicker of a dry weed over the parapet. When both agreed, confidence followed. When they argued, patience held a shot until air made up its mind. The duel rewarded habit. A man might spend half an hour aligning, inside the closed plate, on a chalked point exactly where a suspected enemy loophole would be once the shutter went up, so that when the hinge lifted the reticle did not hunt. It settled. Periscope discipline, never lingering, never showing the same sliver at the same height and angle twice in a row, kept eyes attached to faces. The crack thump of a supersonic bullet and its report gave direction and distance. 2 or 3 such notes, separated by seconds and plotted with a pencil, closed a triangle on a pocket card that an officer could hand to a trench mortar crew or a field gun with a grid. The most effective counter-sniping in 1915 and 1916 looked dull on paper. Marks in a notebook that turned into a single high-explosive shell on a slit at 11:20. Armor and obstacles forced their own refinements. Steel loophole plates that had given men confidence in the spring became invitations to overconfidence by summer. Special armor-piercing rounds, and simply persistent aim at bolt heads and hinges made them less safe. Periscopes that had felt like immunity shattered under direct fire when a patient shot found the mirror. In some sectors, purpose-made armor-piercing bullets were issued for exactly those problems. Elsewhere, teams made do with angle and timing, placing a round through an opening at the instant a shutter moved or a periscope rose. When a plate could not be beaten one way, it was beaten another. A mortar bomb laid the parapet flat and made the fight about Earth again. The most important change was organizational. By 1916, the British First Army School of Sniping, Observation and Scouting had turned good shots into disciplined specialists and infused entire battalions with basic survival sense. The school's teaching was deliberately plain. Never show a straight line. Never open a slit twice in a row at the same height. Use mirrors to find glint, not eyes. Fire through the smallest opening you can make. Make a range card. Keep a log. The course taught report writing along with stalking, a simple template: time, place, weather, what was seen, what was done, so that a sniper's day could be read by an artillery lieutenant or a company sergeant and turned into action. The German army, already rich in optics and hunting skill, institutionalized its own best practice in parallel. Pairing, patient routines, and the habit of aiming at places rather than at people. Snipers did more than kill. They were the front line's best observers by daylight. A trained pair could map an enemy's routine in a week, where ration parties crossed at dusk, where a trench mortar team kept its spare bombs, which traverse hit a telephone, where a listening post crept out at night to leave a wire marker for dawn. That knowledge moved upward as quietly as it had been gathered. Divisional artillery programs in 1916 and 1917 regularly drew on sniper reports to plan harassment fire and to account for the one machine gun nest that always survived a preliminary bombardment unless a special round found it on the minute it habitually revealed itself. On other fronts, the pattern adapted to terrain and weather. In the Dardanelles, snipers learned to live by periscope and the shortest exposures of the war, shaping rifles to mirrors because bare skin above a parapet did not last a second after sunrise. In the Alps, Austro-Hungarian and Italian marksmen read wind from snow banners and accepted that thin air changed even the breath a man could hold. Shots came slower, longer, steadier. On the Eastern Front, where woods and long fields replaced the endless right angles of Flanders, hides pushed forward and back with a fluidity the Western Front rarely knew, but the same small grammar: scan, mark, wait, count, lift, release, decided most outcomes. A typical day's ledger looked plain and told everything. Dawn scan, no change at revetment, new brush above culvert, periscope shattered opposite C14 at 0730. Enemy mortar set at 0930 behind 3rd Traverse. Single shot fired 1012. Return fire ceased. The tone matched the work. Exact, spare, unhurried. If a duel flared, it took place in seconds that had been prepared for an hour. The flap lifted by the back of a hand, the reticle already settled, the breath released into the trigger, the shutter dropped, the partner already watching the opposite slit for habit's return. A mistake in that routine wrote itself in blunt terms into the same book an hour later. The kit that supported all this got more standardized as the war went on. Units issued hoods and face veils as a matter of course. Scope mounts came in patterns that armorers could service without filing. Loophole plates were numbered and mapped so reliefs could inherit angles rather than guess them. Ammunition lots were kept together so a sniper's Zyro held over weeks. Rifles were set aside from general issue and tracked by serial number, each with its log of shots and small repairs, because familiarity meant time saved, and time saved meant lives spared along a parapet that felt shorter each month. What made the scary seconds truly decisive was not glamour, but accumulation. Every advantage a trained pair gained, less glass showing, fewer glints, a smoother shutter, a better sense of wind, shaved a fraction of a second off exposure. Those fractions added up to a margin that could be spent on a deliberate shot when a decoy head bobbed, or pocketed when a reflection looked not quite right. The practice looked simple: 3 seconds to look, 2 to decide, 1 to release. It stood on hours of adjustment that an untrained eye could not see, and on habits that turned nerves into a quiet routine. By mid-1916, an entire division's daylight behavior in quiet sectors hinged on whether its snipers had done their job at breakfast. Working parties moved when a periscope dipped and a hand waved. Runners hugged the traverse an extra pace because a team had noted a fresh bullet scar on the opposite revetment. A trench mortar fired 2 bombs into an empty bay because a report had named it as the place a loophole shutter always flicked a moment too long. When the barrage swelled and infantry climbed the ladders for an attack, snipers went forward in the second wave with the same notebooks and the same economy, taking over captured parapets, mapping new slits, and making sure the next day's routine began with a little more control than the last. The thing that stayed constant across fronts and years was the scale. This work lived in inches and seconds. A scope's objective wrapped in gauze could be the difference between life and a glint noticed. A sling hole cut in the same sandbag and used every day could be the difference between a reticle that hunted and one that settled. A periscope lowered 1 second earlier than habit could be the difference between a diary entry and a letter home sent by someone else. The tools changed from unit to unit. The rhythm did not. The schools made the difference. Once armies accepted that the front would not move by miles in a day, they began to teach the craft that let a single second matter. In early 1916, the British First Army organized a dedicated school of sniping, observation, and scouting in France under officers who had learned their lessons the slow, expensive way at the parapet. The course was short, typically a fortnight, but dense. Mornings were for glass and wind. Afternoons were for loopholes, range cards, and the choreography of opening a shutter, settling a reticle, and closing the plate again without leaving a pattern. Evenings belonged to logs. Time, weather, mirage, distances proved and distances guessed, and notes on what habit looked like in the trench opposite. Instruction started with the eyes. Recruits learned to scan in sectors and to let the scene move across the scope rather than hunting for detail with small, jerky motions that tired the muscles around the lens long before noon. Mirage, heat bent into visible drift, was taught as grammar. A left-leaning shimmer meant a left-to-right wind. A flat, fast shimmer meant more wind than the grass below admitted. Periscopes were handled as if they were weapons. The rule was simple and strict. Never show the same sliver at the same height twice in a row. On the range, instructors put up head-size plates at 200 to 400 yards and painted a single loophole the width of a thumb. The task was not just to hit the plate. It was to touch that opening with a first round from a cold barrel after a minute of watching and 5 seconds of work. Equipment matched the method. British rifles on the benches were mostly SMLEs and, increasingly, pattern 1914 Enfields. Their weight and long sight radius married well to Aldous tubes or periscopic prism company sights on offset mounts. Canadians, who had been early adopters, demonstrated the Ross rifle's strengths in clean conditions with Warner and Swassey prismatic scopes, the sight ungainly but useful at range. Across the line, German instructors set Gewehr 98s into rests behind armored loopholes and taught with Zeiss or Guertz 3 times and 4 times glass, side-mounted so charges could still be used. The rifles were ordinary by design. What mattered was that the same sling hole in the same sandbag meant the cheek found the same place, and the reticle did not have to hunt when the shutter came up. Hides and plates were classrooms of their own. Recruits practiced building a loophole that did not shine, then adding a gauze screen a hand's breadth in front of it to catch reflections their eye could not see, but an opponent's might. They learned the double loophole trick, opening a decoy slit first to draw a test shot and dust plume, then working off that line with the real opening a pace away. Mirrors set below the parapet trained them to find enemy glints without giving one back. Dummy heads, moved on rods in brief, irregular lifts, taught impulse control on both sides of the slit. The student who fired at the wrong rhythm learned what his own habit looked like to an enemy taking notes. Range work emphasized estimates that could be proved in a breath. Scope reticles of the day were plain crosswires, so students learned to use known heights, the course of sandbags, a helmet rim, the visible width of a traverse, to translate apparent size into distance. They kept private tables in a pocketbook, copied from battalion charts but adjusted to their own rifles and ammunition. The British .303 Mark 7 Spitze and the German S-Patron gave flatter trajectories than pre-war round-nose rounds, but only if a man knew where his zero lived and wrote down what the rifle said on still mornings. Wind calls were made twice, once by mirage and again by what the grass admitted. If the two disagreed, the shot waited. Counter-sniping was taught as patient geometry. Students learned to plot the crack thump, supersonic snap, then muzzle report, as a rough rangefinder and direction giver, drawing lines on a card from 2 or 3 known positions to close on a likely slit. Instructors showed how dust off a fresh sandbag repair or a faint puff from a loophole shutter could confirm a mark. Mortar and artillery officers visited the class. A good sniper's triangle, translated to a trench map grid, could be worth a single well-timed shell that ended a week-long duel. The point, written on a slate in block letters, was unemotional. Make the other side expose at your time, not his. Fieldcraft bridged school and trench. Camouflage rules were spare and enforceable. Break the outline, dull the shine, move like nothing at all. Helmets got Hessian sleeves and net. Scope bells were wrapped. Faces and hands went under a thin veil or a rub of soot. Even scent had its place. Students were told to oil lightly and to sit upwind of their own rifle when they could choose. Sweet-smelling oils from rear depots had a way of drifting through a slit on a still morning. In sectors where ground allowed, the class practiced pushing a small timbered box into a shell hole forward of the line under darkness, dressing its face with sacking and mud until it read as earth at first light. Inside, space was measured in inches, a rest for the rifle, a cut for the sling, and a shutter that could be lifted with the back of a glove without showing a straight line. Other armies formalized in parallel. German units paired trained shots and observers as a matter of routine and taught sighting on places. Aim at the habit, not the man, where runners always cut the corner of a traverse, where a trench mortar team stacked its spare bombs after dawn, where an observer's periscope sat a finger's width high when he tired. Austro-Hungarian and Italian schools in the Alps added altitude lessons. Thinner air stretched the pause between breaths and changed how mirage read along snow banners. In the Dardanelles, the periscope rifle was not a curiosity, but a necessity, and instruction focused on the shortest exposures of the entire war. By mid-1916, the training had shortened the duel. Teams arrived at the line with a routine that saved fractions of a second and then spent them only when it counted. A morning ledger from a competent pair reads like a template. Dawn scan, no change at revetment, new brush above culvert, periscope opposite B12 shattered at 0730. Enemy mortar at 0930 behind third traverse, single shot fired 1012. Return fire ceased. The economy is the point. The slit opens rarely. When it does, the reticle settles because everything around it is the same as yesterday. Sling, cheek, eye relief, the chalk mark inside the plate where dead center already lives. The American Expeditionary Forces entered late and learned fast. In 1917 to 1918, U.S. divisions borrowed British schools, manuals, and, in some cases, glass. The M1903 Springfield served as the main precision rifle with Warner and Swazi prismatic sights in early issue, and other commercial scopes like the Winchester A5 were available. Some units fielded British pattern rifles and optics through Allied depots when supply allowed. American courses mirrored British ones. Periscope discipline, range cards, logs written to be useful to artillery, and pair work that treated the observer's voice as part of the rifle's mechanism. In the line, snipers became the quiet regulators of daytime routine. Working parties waited for their nod. Runners chose the left side of a bay, because yesterday's bullet scar on the right-hand revetment said the opposite team sighted on that habit. A trench mortar fired 2 bombs into an empty traverse at 10 past the hour because a report named it as the place where an enemy shutter always flicked a second too long after breakfast. When raids went forward at night, the same men mapped out listening posts and taped lanes in the dusk, then took their glass into captured bays before dawn to begin the next day's ledger. Armor forced adaptation rather than bravado. Steel loophole plates, comforting in the spring, became less so by summer. Specialized armor-piercing bullets were issued in some sectors. Elsewhere, persistence at bolt heads and hinge lines, or a single round timed for the instant a shutter lifted, did the same work. Periscopes that felt like immunity shattered under a patient shot aimed at the mirror itself. When plates could not be beaten with a bullet, mortars flattened the parapet and returned the problem to earth and shovel. Weather wrote its own syllabus. In rain, periscopes fogged, and glass needed a smear. Soap, spit, anything that kept lenses from blooming white at the moment they mattered. In cold, metal showed breath. Students were taught to keep the shutter a finger's width from the cheek to avoid a visible cloud, and to warm the bolt by touch before the first lift so it would not stick and cost a second that could not be spared. In heat, barrels crept. The habit of checking point of impact at first light, even with a single round into a buried plate, paid for itself by mid-morning. What made all of this decisive was not a secret device or a heroic shot. It was a routine that turned nerves into timing. The schools taught that routine, battalions protected it, companies structured their daylight work around it. The duel collapsed into a handful of practiced motions because everything else that could be standardized had been. Instructors put it in sentences that fit on one line of a blackboard and in drills that lasted a minute and were repeated until they felt like one breath. See without being seen, prepare without moving, expose without showing a straight line, release without surprise, disappear without a pattern. And, because the work lived in inches and seconds, the ledger mattered as much as the rifle. A pair's pocket cards outlived their assignment. range to the post, angle to the culvert, the shutter that flicked at 10 past the hour, the machine gun that always answered a trench mortar's second bomb, and not the first. Those notes moved to the relief like a relay, and with them went the narrow margin that kept men alive along a parapet only a few feet high. The rifles and the glass changed hands. The seconds did not. They were won in training and spent in daylight, in slits and shutters and habits that could be timed, and the men who kept them understood exactly what they were buying each morning when they lifted a plate with the back of a glove and let the reticle settle where it had settled yesterday. The work of the schools showed first in places where the ground punished haste. On the Somme in 1916, when mine craters and shattered trenches remade the front into a field of overlapping bowls, a sniper's day began in a timbered box forward of the line, pushed into a shell hole under darkness and dressed at dawn to look like earth. The slit was a finger's width, gauzed an inch in front to catch reflections the eye would miss. Inside, the rifle lay already settled in a cut sandbag, sling hole pricked where yesterday's cheek weld had lived. The observer drew his first sector scan with a periscope, not glass, crest to crest, traverse to traverse, marking the new. A fresh sandbag seam on the opposite parapet, a wisp of damp on a shutter that had not shown the day before, brush where timbers had been naked. These were small things. On the Somme, small things were the only things that lasted till noon. Crater posts taught a new geometry. Lines that had once faced across now faced around. An enemy loophole might sit 30 yards off your front, but speak into your right. Teams learned to sight on habit at close quarters. The corner where a runner cut because duck boards had broken on the other side. The mound where a Lewis gun always rested between bursts. The sliver of sky that flashed when a shutter opened against the light. When artillery lifted for a few minutes and the instinct to look rose with it, those were the seconds that decided life. The rifle did not hunt then. It settled. The shutter opened with the back of a glove. The reticle found the coin of daylight it had been pointed at inside the closed plate for half an hour. The breath stopped, and the shot went the way a word goes when it has been practiced until it is quiet. Further north at Verdun that same year, the duel compressed into moments that left no room for argument. French observers lived under armored plates set into traverses, periscopes no higher than a hand, glass dulled and wrapped. German Jaegers, rich in optics and patience, waited on angles rather than on faces, on the exact place a periscope sat when an officer with a map forgot himself, on the habit a ration party displayed when it crept the same 5 paces along a spoil bank at dusk. The counter was not bravado, it was report writing. Crack at 0814. Thump 2 seconds later. Dust off bolt head of plate at D-3. 2 more notes like that gave a triangle. A mortar crew with the grid turned guesswork into a single round. The duel ended with no story to tell, the way most of them did. Arras and Vimy Ridge in April 1917 showed what trained teams could do for an entire corps. Canadian battalions had formal sniper, scout, and observer sections by then. Their ledgers did not glow. They read like patient carpentry. Range cards penciled with distances to each post and traverse. Bearings to culverts and sap heads. Times when shutters flicked, 10 past and 25 past the hour. And the exact places where glints appeared after breakfast. On the day of assault, those notes did not turn men into ghosts. They turned minutes into something that could be spent. Working parties crossed wire under a nod. Runners hugged a left-hand traverse because bullet scars on the right-hand revetment told a story about the other side's habits. When captured bays turned outward at noon, the same notebooks began again. Flip to a clean page that already had the new horizon sketched on it. Messines in June and the third Ypres, that summer pressed on different nerves. At Messines, the ground rose and rolled in long backs with clean views. The lesson there was restraint. Glass tempted you to look too long. The schools had already written the cure. Periscope discipline in seconds, never the same sliver twice, never the same angle thrice. At Ypres, Passchendaele, mud made rules of its own. Mirage went dull. Lenses bloomed white with breath and drizzle at the wrong moment. Students had been taught the small answers that mattered. A smear on an objective to keep fog from blooming. A finger's width between cheek and shutter to hide exhaust in cold. Bolt warmed by touch before the first lift in a morning that made steel sulk. None of it was glamorous. All of it spent or saved a second. Defenses adapted and dragged the duel with them. Loophole plates, comforting in spring, grew less so by summer. Armor-piercing rounds issued in some sectors scuffed bolt heads and tore hinges. Patience aimed at the instant a shutter moved, did the rest. Periscopes that had felt like immunity shattered under a shot, aimed at the mirror itself. When a plate could not be beaten with a bullet, a short trench mortar flattened the parapet and turned the problem back into dirt and shovel. The principle held, don't argue with steel, change the conversation. If you read a good team's day from the ledger forward, you can watch the seconds gather and get spent. Dawn. No change at revetment B12. New brush above culvert. C3. Periscope opposite shattered 0730. Mid-morning. Enemy mortar set 0930 behind 3rd Traverse. Single shot fired 1012. Return ceased. Afternoon. Working party observed at 1410. 3 men. Route shifted to left side of a bay. Each line looks small. Together they made a schedule for the company, then the battalion. When an artillery lieutenant asked for a useful grid, a triangle already waited in pencil. When the sergeant picked a time for a wire party, the nod came from the man who had counted shutters all morning. Personalities rose within that method, and their exploits were recorded without the noise memory likes to add. An Australian at Gallipoli the year before, famous later for the number attached to his name, worked with a spotter and a periscope rifle because anything else above the parapet after dawn was suicide. His reputation grew because his routine never changed. A Canadian scout sniper on the Western Front earned decorations for bringing men back from patrols and for the same short, exact pulses that opened pillboxes on the airfield terraces a year later. The numbers attached to him in newspapers were guesses, but the citations praised the same thing the schools had taught. Control, not show. Across lines, German doctrine kept its shape. Pair work. Aim at places, not at faces. Count the seconds after a barrage lifts, because men look then. Use good glass and keep it dull. Austrian and Italian notes from the high fronts added altitude's footnotes. Thin air stretched the hold on the breath. Mirage wrote its wind along snow banners more honestly than grass ever would. In the Dardanelles, where periscopes were rifles and rifles were mirrors, the shortest exposures of the war became routine, and the lesson came back to France, written in practical ink. If the slit must be smaller, learn to fire through something smaller. The kit standardized to match the work. Rifles were kept out of general issue, tracked by serial number, and logged for point of impact the way a field gun's bore sight lives in a book. Mounts settled into patterns armorers could service without filing. Scope bells wore wraps. Helmets wore hessian and net. Face and hand veils sat in pouches like any other tool. Ammunition lots stayed with a rifle as long as quartermasters could manage it, so the Zero did not wander for reasons a man could not control. Everything in this trade lived in inches and in the habit of not wasting them. A hessian flap hung behind a loophole to adjust the background tone so a face was not a disk against sky. A mirror set below the parapet to borrow a square of cloud into a suspected slit without showing your own. A slit opened with the back of a glove to avoid the bright line fingers turned into when they moved. Each small improvement bought part of a second. Those fractions could be hoarded for when a dummy head bobbed and drew fire at the wrong rhythm, or spent when a shutter flicked exactly as it always did at 10 past the hour. Artillery learned to treat sniper reports as instruments rather than as anecdotes. Crack-thump notes turned into range and bearing. Dust plumes off bolt heads marked hinge lines. A single 18-pounder shell at a named minute ended a week-long exchange more surely than a dozen brave exposures. Trench mortars took their own cues. 2 bombs into the empty bay that always hid the slit at breakfast, not because anyone saw a man there that day, but because the ledger said habit lived there. Raids at night drew on the same economy. Snipers walked tape lines at dusk, marked listening posts, and left modest signals, rags tied twice, a scratch at the first bend, that turned dawn into bearings and clicks on a card. Before sunrise, the same men lay behind new plates in bays that had changed ownership at midnight, glassing a horizon they had drawn in their heads while they were still in the dark. Weather kept a say, and the schools had an answer for that too. In rain, lenses needed a film, soap or spit, to keep them from blooming white. In cold, the shutter stayed a finger's width off a cheek, and the bolt got warmed by palm before the first lift, so breath and metal didn't betray the moment. In heat, barrels crept and men checked point of impact at first light with a single round into a buried plate so the day would not learn the truth at the wrong time. By 1917, the trade's lines ran clean. A trained pair, a rifle that returned to the same zero, hides built to be seen as earth, glass handled as if it were a signal flag to an enemy, watching for the smallest hint of a straight line. The duel that had once felt like chance shortened into a drill that left little to luck. The scary seconds in which life shifted did not go away. They were fenced round by habits that bought them in the first place. Scan without being seen, prepare without moving, expose without a pattern, release without surprise, disappear without a trace that could be read tomorrow. Read the ledgers from that period, and you see the shape of a day that entire battalions learned to live by. Stand to completed. Periscope shattered opposite B-12 at 0730. Enemy mortar positioned 0930 behind 3rd Traverse. Single round 1012. Return fire ceased. Working party observed 1410. Route altered. None of it looks dramatic. All of it is what allowed men to cross a lane at 3 in the afternoon and wash a tin at dusk without donating their profiles to an angle that had been pre-sighted since breakfast. The rifles and the glass did their part. The seconds did the rest. Winter bled into 1917 with the craft no longer an improvisation but a discipline written into diaries, orders, and the daily grammar of a trench. The first half hour after stand to still decided the tone of a day. Yet by now it unfolded with rehearsed economy. A periscope's slow sector scan, pencil marks for anything new, a seam of fresh sandbags, a damp stain on a shutter, scrub that yesterday had been wood, followed by the quiet preparation of a single firing lane that might be used once before noon, or not at all. The rifle lay where yesterday's cheek had lived, sling tension set, a chalk dot scratched on the inside face of the plate so the reticle would fall into the same coin of daylight the instant the shutter lifted. It was work that spent seconds like coin and accounted for them in a hand small enough that a glove could keep the pencil steady. The ground itself had learned to argue back. On the Somme broken bowls and angled craters, the fight rarely ran straight across. It ran around. An enemy loophole could sit barely 30 paces off your front and speak into your flank. So teams learned to sight on habit at short range. The elbow-high notch where runners cut a traverse because the boards had gone on the other side. The spoil heap where a Lewis gun always settled between bursts. The narrow bright that flashed when a shutter opened against sky. The opening that mattered was often measured in thumb widths, and the shot that counted was the one released into a pattern watched for an hour, not a face seen for a heartbeat. German plates scuffed at bolt heads and hinges showed how often patience, not penetration, beat armor. Verdun compressed the duel to seconds and insisted on logs. French observers under armored plates treated periscopes as if they were flags, lifted irregularly, never twice at the same height, always for less time than a guess would like. German Jaegers waited on places rather than people and counted for the moments when habit returned. The check after a barrage lifted. The pause after breakfast when a shutter flicked a heartbeat long on the same minute day after day. The counter was geometry. Crack at 0814. Thump 2 seconds later. Dust off bolt head at D-3. After 2 more such notes, a triangle closed on a slit, and a single well-timed mortar bomb ended what had felt like a personal quarrel. Arras and Vimy Ridge brought the craft out of the alcove and into the plan. Canadian sniper, scout, observer sections arrived with their own schedules. Range cards penciled to each post and traverse, bearings to culverts, sapheads, and the pale edges of buried plates. Notations on glints that appeared only after breakfast, and shutters that twitched at 10 past and 25 past the hour. When the infantry moved, those notebooks turned into minutes that could be spent. Working parties crossed wire behind a nod. Runners hugged the left side of a bay because a pencil mark on yesterday's card meant the right-hand revetment had been sighted on across the way. By noon, captured bays faced outward, and the same men began again on a clean page, the horizon reversed. Cambrai added something new to the ledger. Machines. Tanks nosed through mist and wire in November 1917, while teams forward of the line treated them like moving interruptions in a familiar pattern. Early that day, the enemy's loopholes spoke less often. Shutters fidgeted and then shut. Instructors had taught the answer before the first rhomboid silhouette ever reached a trench. Don't look longer because the scene is interesting. Keep the seconds short. The Germans' answer, hardened core bullets meant for loopholes and soon for tanks, arrived the same winter. Plates that had comforted men in spring demanded better habits by year's end. Aim at bolt heads, time the shutter, and let steel be solved by angle and silence rather than by a long argument of shots. Ypres, Passchendaele, dragged the craft through weather. Mirage flattened in cold rain, fog breathed inside scopes, breath printed on shutters, bolts sulked. The schools had given plain cures. Smear the objective to keep bloom from washing the view. Lift the plate a finger's width from the cheek so exhaust doesn't flag the opening. Warm metal by touch before the first lift in air that turns oil to glue. On the dry days, barrels crept. Men learned to confirm point of impact at first light with a single round into a buried plate so the day would not teach the lesson at the wrong time. None of this read like drama. All of it bought fractions of seconds that could be saved for when sight and habit finally met at the right instant. By 1917, the kit had settled into patterns that armorers understood and quartermasters could support. Rifles were pulled from general issue and tracked by serial. Zeros lived in notebooks the way a field gun's bore sight lived in a drawer. Aldous and Periscopic Prism Company glass rode British SMLUs and pattern 1914S on offset mounts. Canadians still coaxed clean accuracy from the Ross in trained hands. German Gewehr 98s carried Zeiss and Goertz 3 times and 4 times scopes on side mounts that left charges clear. Scope bells were wrapped, objective rims dulled, Face veils and Hessian helmet covers sat in pouches like any other tool. Ammunition lots, .303 Mark 7th and 7.92 S Patron, stayed with the rifle as long as paper could make it so. Familiarity saved seconds. Seconds saved lives. The American Expeditionary Forces arrived with borrowed books and a quick eye for what mattered. M1903. Springfield's wore Warner and Swazi prismatic sights in early issue, and other commercial tubes were depots allowed. Some units took British pattern glass from Allied stocks. American courses followed British boards almost word for word. Periscope discipline measured in seconds. Range cards that a lieutenant with a map could use without translation. Pair work that treated the observer's whisper like part of the rifle's mechanism. At Cantigny, Château Thierry, Belleau Wood, and in the Meuse-Argonne, American logs began to read like everyone else's. Dawn scan, glint noted, mortar set, single shot, return ceased, because the ground had taught the same grammar on both sides of the ocean. The German spring offensives of 1918 tested everything learned in quiet sectors. Fog and infiltration made angles new. Stormtroop parties moved by folds and nulls, cutting communication and slipping through weak places. Snipers answered by turning from gatekeepers to brakes. Pairs set forward in shell holes as the line bent, glassing for the habits that still revealed themselves even in a rush. The check over a shoulder at a junction, the instinct to glance up a traverse before turning into it. The moment when a runner lifted his head to read a sign because he could not help it. The best teams sighted on those places and held lanes long enough for a company to find a new edge to stand on. When the push ebbed and the ground began to move back the other way, the same men climbed church towers and factory shells at dawn, mapping machine gun flashes and naming the shutters that still flicked to their own clocks in the middle of a retreat. Countermeasures multiplied with speed and read like common sense written down. Dummy heads and periscope tips on rods still had a place, but they were moved only in broken rhythms. Mirrors below the parapet borrowed sky into suspected slits without giving one back. Double loopholes, decoy first, real aperture second, stole a test shot and marked a line for the day. Forward boxes went into shell holes under darkness and were dressed at dawn with sacking and mud until they read as earth. In ruined villages, teams turned window mouths into slits no wider than a coin and learned to fire through brick lintels rather than show a clean line against daylight. Artillery and trench mortars made sniper reports into instruments rather than anecdotes. Crack thump gave rough range and direction. Dust plumes off bolt heads wrote hinge locations. A single 18-pounder round at a named minute ended a week's harassment more reliably than any brave exposure. Mortar crews kept their own clocks keyed to habits named in pencil. 2 bombs into the empty bay that always hid the slit after breakfast. Not because someone saw a man there today, but because someone had seen that shutter flicker at the same minute for 5 days and written it down. Raids and patrols did not stop for doctrine. They sharpened it. At dusk, snipers walked tape lines and cut modest signs, rags tied twice on dead scrub, a scratch at the first bend in a trench, so that at first light those marks became bearings and clicks in a corporal's notebook. Before sunrise, the same men lay behind new plates on parapets that had changed hands at midnight, glassing a reversed horizon and beginning again with 3 lines that would decide whether a working party lived to wash mugs at dusk. The psychology of the craft left marks that no map showed. Signs on duckboards, "Keep your head down," were not decoration. They were the prose of experience. Men learned to lift and lower with their knees rather than with their backs because an enemy sighted on the corner of a traverse, not on the middle. They learned to roll sleeves down even on hot days because an exposed forearm was a straight line against dark dirt. They learned that mugs steamed in ways a patient rifle across the way could see. The scare in scary seconds lived in the way ordinary motions, look up, take a sip, stand on the right instead of the left, could be timed and punished unless a pair had stolen those habits a few minutes at a time before breakfast. By summer 1918, the craft had 2 speeds. In quiet sectors, it moved like an audit: periscope, pencil, slit, single round, shutter, note. In moving battles, it behaved like a brake and a scout at once, a pair setting up in the angle of a street to hold a corner for half an hour, while a company turned. Another on a factory roof, naming far shutters so guns behind could speak accurately through dust and rumor. The rifles had not changed greatly since the winter. The seconds had. They were shorter and spent more deliberately. The ledger followed suit. Fewer lines, each with more consequence. What held over everything was the habit of control. No long washes of exposure, no second look after a barrage. No show at a window when down through a lintel would do. The tools were simple and their edges understood: glass, gauze, plate, sling. A rifle that shared breath with a trigger and never surprised its owner. The rest lived in the way a team let the reticle fall where it had fallen yesterday and trusted that a day's worth of patient subtractions would leave, at some point, 1 clear second. When it arrived, there was no drama left in it. There was a shutter, a breath, and a release, practiced until it sounded like a word spoken softly in a room where everyone already knew what it meant. The last winter of the war taught snipers to work in places that barely qualified as trenches. Lines bent around mine craters, farm walls, sunken roads, and the carcasses of villages that had been shelled until only angles remained. A team's morning began exactly as before: stand to, periscope scan, pencil marks for anything new. But the picture they read had changed. The opposite parapet might be a collapsed cellar mouth. The lane they needed to regulate might run through a gap in a brick gable. The craft that the schools had hammered into habit: scan, mark, wait, open with the back of the glove, reticle already settled, followed the front into ruins and woods without losing a beat. In crater fields, geometry turned sideways. What looked like front and flank on a map became a ring of threats at 30 to 80 paces. A German loophole that had once stared across from sandbags now peered from the broken corner of a traverse into a team's right side. The answer was the same rule, applied closer: sight on habit, not on hope. Watch the elbow-height notch where runners cut the same traverse every hour because the duck boards had gone on the other side. Fix the spoil heap where a light machine gun always rested between bursts. Take the narrow flash of sky that appears when a shutter opens against light at 10 past the hour every day. The plate stayed shut until the habit returned. Then the shot was 2 motions long: lift, release, and the shutter fell again. In villages, the duel acquired a new look. Windows were death if you showed a straight line against daylight. Teams chipped firing slots under lintels and fired through brick, not across empty panes. In good positions, a loophole plate from the trench line was bolted into a doorway and packed with rubble until it read as masonry. Scope bells wore gauze. Objective rims were dulled with soot or paint so no light winked back across the street. When the wind shifted down an alley, men noticed whether the sweet trace of oil drifted out of the hide and gave the place away. Good teams oiled lightly and sat upwind of their own rifles when they could choose. The fronts that had seemed fixed became mobile in fits. In March 1918, the German offensives, fog, short violent bombardments, and assault groups slipping through gaps, made the duel fluid. Storm troop parties used folds and nulls, knife-edge discipline and pace. Snipers answered as brakes and as scouts. pairs set forward in shell holes where the line bent and glasted for the small tells that still betrayed a movement even when everything else was confusion. The check over a shoulder before turning into a communication trench. The glance up a traverse at a junction. The instinct to lift a head high enough to read a signboard whose letters were half gone. A well-placed shot at those moments did more than take a man out of a file. It held a lane for 10 minutes while a company found a new edge to stand on. When the ground began to move back the other way in late summer, the 100 days, snipers kept their routine and changed their vantage. Church towers and factory shells tempted a climb. Experience taught a different instinct. High points drew shelling. Better to work a second story behind a shattered lintel, or the shadow of a barn gable that faced the right field of fire. Air photographs and battery maps reached Company HQ faster now. Sniper reports linked to them naturally. A range card that named a culvert and a clock time beside it. Shutter flicks, 10 past, 25 past. Sat under a photo that showed the same scene from above. A trench mortar sergeant took the grid and laid 2 bombs into habit at the appointed minute. The duel ended without show. Kit kept pace with the tasks and stayed simple. Rifles were steady by design, not exotic. British, SMLES and pattern 1914S with Aldis or periscopic prism company glass. Canadian Ross rifles in trained hands. German Gewehr 98s with Zeiss or Goers, 3 times and 4 times optics on side mounts. American M1903. Springfields with Warner and Swazi prismatic sights and, where depots allowed, other commercial scopes. Mounts left chargers clear and iron sights usable. Scope bells were wrapped. Face veils rode in the same pouch as a periscope. Ammunition lots stayed with rifles so the Zero did not wander for reasons a man could not control. Familiarity shaved fractions of a second off the one exposure that mattered. Armor pushed technique instead of bravado. Steel loophole plates that had comforted men in 1915 were no longer shields to lean on. They were problems to solve. Early in 1917, the German answer, hardened core K-bullets, Spitzgeschüsse mit Kern, made short work of hinges and bolt heads at workable ranges. In many sectors, the best counter remained the old one. Don't argue with steel. Change the conversation. Wait for the instant a shutter moved and place the shot through the opening. If a plate could not be beaten with a bullet, a Stokes mortar or field gun flattened the surrounding earth and made it about shovels again. Weather still wrote its own terms, and the schools had filled the margins. In rain, lenses needed a film, soap, spit, anything to keep bloom from washing the view at the wrong second. In cold, breath turned to a flag if a cheek pressed against a shutter. Men learned to keep a finger's width of air between skin and steel. In heat, barrels crept, and a single round into a buried plate at first light saved the day from teaching a lesson the hard way at 10. Gas alarms made periscopes and patience more valuable than rifles for an hour. Firing a scope rifle in a respirator was a bad trick at best. Teams waited their chances and kept logs going even when glass was the only instrument they could use. The best deception belonged to camouflage units and observers, and snipers learned to borrow it. The observation tree, a steel trunk disguised as a blasted stump, installed at night to replace a real tree sawed and lifted away, housed observers more often than rifles, but its principle traveled. Build the hide into the landscape, not onto it. In crater fields, forward boxes pushed into shell holes under darkness and dressed with sacking and mud until they read as earth at first light. In villages, a loophole cut through a hayrick and faced with net and chaff breathed less and showed less than any window slit could. Report writing remained the unseen instrument that tied everything together. A day's ledger in a good sector still read as plain as the edge of a ruler. Stand to completed. No change at revetment. B12. New brush above culvert. C3. Periscope opposite shattered 0730. Enemy mortar positioned 0930 behind third traverse. Single round 1012. Return ceased. Working party observed 1410. Route altered to left side of bay. To outsiders, the lines looked small. To the company, they were the schedule. Working parties moved when a periscope dipped and a hand waved. Runners hugged a traverse because yesterday's bullet scar on the opposite revetment told a story, and a sniper had taken the time to write it down. American units folded into this grammar quickly. At Cantigny, Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, and in the Meuse-Argonne, American pair work mirrored British routines. Periscope discipline measured in seconds. Range cards that a lieutenant with a map could act on without translation. Logs written for artillery, not for prose. The M1918 Browning automatic rifle appeared late and helped in a specific way. A bar poured a short bank of fire into a suspected slit on command, so a team could move the shutter open for a measured breath without inviting a full chorus back. The rifle with glass still finished arguments. The automatic simply bought that 1 second more predictably. Cooperation tightened as movement returned. Flash spotting and sound ranging sections, artillery crafts in their own right, were accustomed to triangulating batteries. In quiet sectors, they lent their ears and eyes to the small wars. 2 crack-thump notes from a platoon frontage, a dust plume off a bolt head on the third note, and an observer's timestamp were enough for a single, accurate 18-pounder round that ended a week-long exchange. Snipers, for their part, learned to draw their cards in a way that traveled. Grid, bearing, habit, time. A stranger could use what they wrote. Not everything went forward. Some ideas died politely. Telescopes on machine guns looked promising and stayed rare because the gun's job was volume and the optic added little in daylight and much risk. Special masks and visors for sniper protection appeared and disappeared. They saved faces from splinters and cost seconds at the shutter. The trade had a way of discarding what did not buy time. What stayed were the plain things: gauze on glass, soot on bright metal, a sling hole cut into the same bag every day, a mirror set below a parapet to borrow a square of sky into a suspected slit without showing your own. The psychology on both sides settled into respect layered over caution. Signs painted on duckboards, "Keep your head down," were not decoration. They were lessons written in the least sentimental language a soldier knows. Men learned to lift with knees rather than backs because a silhouette lengthened in predictable ways. They learned to drink with mugs tucked low because steam carried above the parapet like a flag. They learned that sleeves rolled up were straight lines against dark dirt. The scary seconds were not theatrical. They were ordinary motions: look, sip, turn, made dangerous by an eye that had already drawn a small triangle in a notebook. Mobile fighting at the end of the year compressed the method into 2 speeds and asked the same people to use both in a day. In the morning, a pair might hold a corner from a farmhouse eave for 20 minutes, so a company could turn a field. Afternoon, they might climb a ladder in a captured lane, bolt a plate into a doorway, wrap glass, and begin again with the slow ledger of a quiet sector. Shutter times, habits, the one slit that still flicked after breakfast. The rifles had barely changed since winter. The seconds had. They were shorter and spent more deliberately, saved in fractions, then used in whole seconds exactly when needed. Through it all, the routine remained the backbone. A periscope first, never the scope. A shutter lifted with the back of the glove, never fingers. A reticle that did not hunt because it had been placed on a chalked dot inside the closed plate for half an hour. A breath stopped at the same point every time. A release that felt like the same words spoken softly. A shutter dropped without waiting to see the result. If a team could keep that sequence intact for a morning, the company behind them could live by a timetable that looked like luck to anyone who had not watched a pencil move across a pocket card all week. The war's horizon widened in the autumn, and snipers found themselves as often writing routes for their own infantry as closing arguments with the enemy's glass. In woods, they read air in leaf flicker and spider silk. In fields, in grass and dust. In ruins, in the thin threads of mortar that moved differently from brick. The craft stayed small on purpose, inches in the slit, seconds on the clock. A rifle that came to the same place because nothing around it changed. The line exhaled when the day allowed, and the ledgers from that season read with the same calm as ever. Short entries that moved whole companies. When the guns ceased, some of the hides still held. Plates bolted into doorways, slots through lintels, boxes dressed into craters that looked like earth until a hand brushed them. The notebooks went into envelopes. Range cards that had begun as sketches became after-action attachments. The rifles were logged out, their zeros and peculiarities written like marginalia in a well-used book. Instructors gathered the sentences that had proved themselves under weather and pressure and turned them back into a drill a recruit could learn in an hour and perfect in a month. The duel in ruins and woods had not changed the grammar. It had proved which words mattered. Open warfare returned in fits and starts, and the craft followed without losing its rhythm. Trenches gave way to scrapes in hedgerows, sunken roads, and the angled mouths of ruined cellars. Parapets became gables, craters, and ditch banks. The morning still began the same way. Stand to, a periscope scan by sectors, pencil ticks for anything new. But what counted as front might now sit 30 yards off to the right, speaking into a lane that the map didn't show. Teams did what the schools had taught, sight on habit, not on hope. They watched the elbow-high notch where runners always cut a traverse because boards had gone on the other side. The spoil heap where a light machine gun habitually rested between bursts. The thin pane of sky that flashed when a shutter caught light at the same minute after breakfast. The plate, whether steel in a trench or a slit under a lintel, stayed shut until habit returned. Then the work was 2 motions long: lift, release, shutter down. In crater fields, the duel ran around, not across. A loophole that once faced you now looked into your flank through the broken corner of a traverse. The reticle had to settle without hunting even at close range, so men made their hides into instruments. Sling hole pricked in the same sandbag, cheek weld marked inside the plate with a faint chalk dot, scope bell wrapped and the objective dulled so no glint wrote your presence for someone else's notebook. Never show a straight line meant different things here. No horizon through a window, no wrist or sleeve against an empty pane, so slots were chipped under lintels and rifles fired through brick, not across light. Villages added their own rules. A window was a promise to the opposite rifle. A slit through a hayrick, faced with net and chaff, breathed less and showed less. Oil became a kind of speech. Sweet-smelling depot grease drifted down an alley and betrayed a hide. Good teams oiled lightly and sat upwind of their own rifles when they could pick the angle. Mirrors below a sill borrowed a square of sky into a suspected aperture without offering one back. Double loopholes, decoy first, reel second, stole a test shot and gave you dust to draw a line with. The German offensives of spring 1918, fog, short violent bombardments, assault groups feeling for seams, made the duel fluid. Stormtroop files used folds and nulls, moved on pace and discipline, and left telephones mute behind them. Snipers answered as breaks and scouts. A pair would set forward in a shell hole where the line bent and hold a lane by aiming at the tells that still betrayed movement, even in confusion. A head lifted to read a sign at a junction, the reflex check over a shoulder before turning into a communication trench, the glance up a traverse at the instant a runner hesitated. One well-timed shot did more than pluck a man from a file. It held ground for 10 minutes, long enough for a company to find an edge to stand on. When the ground began to move the other way in late summer, vantage points tempted, church towers, factory shells, the last high corners of villages. Experience kept teams lower. High places drew shelling and announced themselves. Second stories behind shattered lintels, barn eaves facing the right field, and the shadow under a gable offered steadier minutes. Air photos and battery maps reached Company HQ faster, sniper cards linked to them naturally. A culvert named on a range card, shutter flicks, 10 past, 25 past, sat under a photograph that showed the same seam from above. A trench mortar section took the grid and laid 2 bombs into habit on the appointed minute. The duel ended without show. Equipment stayed plain by design. Rifles with the steady type's armors could keep right. SMLES and PATA 1914S with Aldis or periscopic prism company glass. Ross rifles accurate in trained hands. Gewehr 98s with Zeiss or Gores, 3 times and 4 times optics on side mounts that left charges clear. M1903. Springfields with Warner and Swazi prismatic sights and, where depots allowed, other commercial tubes. Mounts kept irons usable. Scope bells were wrapped. Objectives dulled. Face veils sat in the same pouch as a periscope. Ammunition lots stayed with a rifle so Zeros did not wander for reasons a man couldn't control. Familiarity shaved fractions from the one exposure that mattered. Armor pushed technique rather than bravado. Steel loophole plates that comforted men in 1915 were less convincing by 1917 to 1918 when hardened core bullets began showing up in quantity. The best counter remained the old one. Don't argue with steel. Change the conversation. Time the shutter, and put the round through the opening. If a plate wouldn't yield, a Stokes mortar flattened the bank around it and gave the problem back to shovel and sandbag. Periscopes, useful immunity when used with discipline, still shattered under patient shots aimed at mirrors. Schools had already fixed the cure in memory. Never twice the same height, never thrice the same angle, never long enough to satisfy a guess. Weather kept its say, and the margins were filled in with small, enforceable answers. In rain, an objective needed a film, soap, spit, so bloomed and washed the view at the wrong second. In cold, breath turned into a flag if cheek met shutter. A finger's width of air hid the exhaust. In heat, barrels crept, and one round into a buried plate at first light saved the day from teaching the lesson at 10. Gas hours made glass and patience more valuable than bullets. Firing a scope rifle in a respirator was a bad trick at best. Teams waited their minutes and kept logs going. The ledger mattered as much as the shot. Deception matured with the rest. Observation trees, steel trunks disguised as blasted stumps, belonged mostly to artillery observers, but the principle traveled, built into the landscape, not onto it. Forward boxes pushed into shell holes under darkness and dressed at dawn to read as earth. In ruined streets, a loophole through a chimney breast breathed less and showed less than any window. Dummies, heads and periscope tips still worked when moved in broken rhythms, and only to draw a single test shot before the real slit opened once for a measured breath. The American formations folded into the grammar quickly. At Cantigny, Along the Marne, in the Belleau Wood fighting and later in the Meuse-Argonne, pair work mirrored British routine. Periscope discipline in seconds. Range cards written for a lieutenant with a map rather than for prose. Logs that an artillery captain could read into action without translation. The new Browning automatic rifle, appearing late, added a specific help. A short bank of fire on command into a suspected slit bought 1 extra second for a shutter to lift and fall. The rifle with glass still finished arguments. The automatic bought the breath that made the finish possible. Cooperation tightened as movement returned. Flash spotting and sound ranging sections were accustomed to triangulating guns. In quiet hours, they lent their craft to the small wars. 2 crack-thump notes across a platoon frontage, a dust lift off a bolt head on the 3rd, an observer's timestamp, and an 18-pounder put 1 round into a slit that had been a nuisance all week. Snipers, for their part, learned to draw cards that traveled. Grid, bearing, habit, time, no poetry, just the 4 lines that let a stranger act. Not everything survived practice. Telescopes on machine guns promised more than they delivered. The gun's job was volume, and the glass added little by day, and much risk. Sniper visors and masks saved faces from splinters and cost seconds at the shutter. The trade kept what bought time and quietly left the rest behind. What stayed were the plain things. Gauze on glass, soot on bright edges, a mirror under a sill, a sling hole cut into the same bag each morning. The psychology settled into respect layered over caution. Signs on duckboards, keep your head down, were not decoration, they were prose. Men learned to lift with their knees, not their backs, because silhouettes lengthened in predictable ways. Mugs were tucked low because steam read like a flag above a parapet. Sleeves rolled down because forearms made straight lines against dark dirt. The scare in those seconds lived in ordinary motions. Look, sip, turn, made dangerous by an eye that had already drawn a small triangle in a notebook and was waiting for the habit to return by the minute hand. Mobile fighting compressed the method into 2 speeds and asked the same people to use both before noon. At a crossroads, a pair would hold a corner from a barn eave for 20 minutes so a company could turn a field. An hour later, they would bolt a plate into a doorway on a newly won lane, wrap the glass, and begin again with the slow ledger of a quiet sector. Shutter times, glints, the 1 slit that still flicked after breakfast. The rifles had hardly changed since winter. The seconds had. They were shorter and spent more carefully, saved in fractions and used whole when the day presented the warm, clear opening it would allow. Through it all, the routine stayed the backbone. Periscope first, never the scope. Shutter lifted with the back of the glove, never fingers. Reticles settled because it had been placed on a chalk mark inside the closed plate for half an hour. Breath stopped at the same point every time. Release that felt like the same quiet word. Shutter down without waiting to see. If a pair could keep that sequence intact through the morning, the company behind them could live by a timetable that looked like luck to anyone who hadn't watched a pencil move across a pocket card all week. The ground kept changing names, but the work did not. Sunken lanes became traverses without sandbags. Hedges stood in for parapets. Cellar mouths and half-fallen doorways turned into loopholes no map would ever label. A pair set their morning the old way inside these new rooms. Periscope first, not the scope. A slow sector scan, a pencil mark for anything that had shifted overnight. Fresh chalk-white dust on broken brick, a damp stain under a shutter, a scuff at elbow height on a corner where a runner always brushed past. The rifle lay already settled in a cut sandbag, the sling hole pricked where yesterday's cheek had lived. A faint chalk dot on the plate's inner face told the reticle where to fall when the shutter lifted for a single breath. Habit still decided most shots. In hedgerows, the wind stacked itself, low leaves twitching one way, high leaves writing another, and mirage along a rutted lane told the truth better than the branches above. In villages, the light was hard and pale off plaster, so scope bells wore gauze and soot, and bright edges were killed with a thumb. Windows remained promises to the opposite rifle. Teams chipped slots under lintels and fired through brick, not across empty panes. A mirror, tucked below a sill, borrowed a square of sky into a suspected opening without offering one back. If the hide smelt of depot oil in a narrow street, it moved by a pace and the bottle was changed. Light oil, wiped thin, and the rifle kept upwind, if choice allowed. Range cards turned from neat fans to patchwork. A bearing to the culvert under the road. Paces to the kink in a hedge. A triangle where two walls met that always drew a glance at the same minute after breakfast. The marks still spoke plainly. Grid when a sheet would take a coordinate, sketch when the ground had no numbers to give. Times turned habit into an appointment. A trench mortar sergeant could read that page without knowing the faces behind it. 2 bombs at 10 past the hour into the empty bay that hid a shutter. Not because anyone saw a man there today, but because someone had seen one there every day and written it down. In the spring push when fog, short bombardments, and assault groups feeling for seams made the front fluid, the seconds a pair purchased were wider than a single life. A measured round at the instant a head lifted to read a sign at a junction held a lane long enough for a platoon to find an edge to stand on. The observer's whisper mattered as much as the shot. Now, wait, wind dropped, right side. The rifle answered the way it had been taught. No hunt, no show, a shutter lifted with the back of a glove, a reticle already there, a breath stopped in the same place each time, a release that felt like the same small word, the plate down without waiting to see. As the ground began to move back the other way in late summer, vantage tempted and discipline refused. Church towers, factory shells, tall corners, useful and loudly so, drew shelling like arguments. Second stories behind shattered lintels, barn eaves with a field at the right distance, the long shadow under a gable. These offered minutes that could be spent. Air photographs reached company headquarters with a regularity that would have surprised any man in 1915, and sniper cards nested under them naturally. Culvert east of Orchard, flicks 10 past and 25 past, written beside the pale seam a pilot had caught at noon. Guns placed rounds by card and photograph together, and the small duel ended without anyone lifting a periscope for a last look. The rifles stayed steady on purpose. British SMLEs and Pattern 1914 rifles with Aldis or periscopic prism company glass. Canadian Ross rifles that shot clean in trained hands. German Gewehr 98S with Zeiss or Goertz 3 times and 4 times optics on side mounts that left charges clear. American M19O, 3 Springfields with Warner and Swazi prismatic sights and where depots allowed, other commercial tubes. Mounts kept irons usable. Scope bells were wrapped, objectives dulled. Face veils sat folded with the periscope. Ammunition lots stayed with their rifles so Zeros did not wander for reasons no one at the plate could control. Familiarity shaved fractions from the one exposure that mattered. Armor answered and was met with timing rather than bravado. Steel loophole plates that had comforted in 1915 were less convincing now that hardened core bullets showed in quantity. The cure remained the old one. Place a round through the opening at the instant a shutter lifted. If a plate would not yield, change the conversation with mortars and a shovel. Periscopes kept their safety only when used with strict economy. Never twice at the same height, never thrice at the same angle. never long enough to satisfy an opposite guess. In rain, lenses bloomed unless dressed. In cold, breath flagged if cheek met steel. In heat, barrels crept unless a single round into buried plate proved point of impact at first light. These were not heroics. They were the reasons a second stayed yours when you needed it. Deception matured into craft and then into habit. Forward boxes pushed into shell holes under darkness and dressed at dawn to read as Earth regulated whole days from places no line on a map could show. In streets, a loophole through a chimney breast breathed less and showed less than any window slit. Dummies on rods, heads and periscope tips, were still worth a single test shot if moved in broken rhythms and only once. After that, a dust plume marked a line on a card and the day returned to work. In some sectors, disguised steel observation trees housed artillery eyes more often than rifles, but the principle they proved, hide built into the landscape, not onto it, belonged to everyone. Cooperation tightened as movement returned. Flash spotting and sound-ranging sections that usually drew lines to batteries now and then drew to slits. 2 crack-thump notes across a platoon frontage, a dust lift off a bolt head on the 3rd, an observer's time stamp, and a single field gun round ended a week-long nuisance in one breath. Snipers wrote for strangers, grid, bearing, habit, time. A captain who had never met them could act at once and never know the faces that had saved him guessing. The human side left marks that paper only hints at. Signs, keep your head down, were not decoration. They were minutes bought and sold. Men learned to lift with knees because silhouettes lengthened predictably when backs did, to drink with mugs tucked low because steam ran like a flag above any parapet, to keep sleeves rolled down because forearms made straight lines against dark dirt. The fear in those seconds was not fear of the shot. It was fear of an ordinary motion being timed by an eye that had already drawn a triangle in a notebook and was merely waiting for the minute hand. Claims and tallies were kept with the same lack of drama. The best schools warned against rivalry on numbers. Proofs were dull on purpose. A shattered periscope prism retrieved, a plate's hinge struck on a named minute, a mortar crater on the exact grid where a shutter had always flicked. Silence afterward, recorded by 2 sets of eyes. The point was not to decorate a ledger. It was to know which lanes could be crossed at 3 in the afternoon and which could not. Rotation and relief were as carefully handled as glass. A good pair lived by stillness, but stillness tired the eye. Companies learned to pull snipers on a clock, 2 days forward, 1 day back. Mornings in a cellar slot and afternoons in a barn eave, so the same man did not have to make the same decision with a dull hand. Armorers kept logs that read like a family book, which mount held 0, which bells stayed tight, which sling hole had stretched. Quartermasters learned to keep a pouch of washers and spare igniters for flare pistols next to the bag that held gauze and soot. Nothing in that kit was grand. Everything kept a second from leaking away. American sectors, once settled, showed the same grammar on their pages. Dawn scan. Shutter opposite shattered at 0708. Trench mortar set 0930 behind 3rd Traverse. 1 round 1010. Return ceased. Working party observed 1405. Route altered to left side of bay. The BR's short, tight bank of fire on command helped steal 1 more breath at a slit. The rifle with glass still finished what needed finishing. By the time canal lines and the last strong trench systems were crossed, the work had been reduced, wisely, almost to quiet. A pair would hold a corner from a barn eave just long enough for a company to turn a field, then step forward at noon, bolt a plate into a doorway in a newly won lane, wrap the glass, dull the edges, and begin again with a slow ledger that turned a chaotic street into a timetable. Shutter times, glints, the one slit that still flicked after breakfast. The rifles had not changed much since winter. The seconds had. They were saved in fractions and spent whole in the one clear opening the day would offer. What never changed was the backbone. Periscope first, plate lifted with the back of a glove. Reticle settled because it had been placed on the chalk dot inside the closed slit for half an hour. Breath stopped at the same point. Release that felt like the same quiet word. Shutter down without watching the result. Kept intact in places that no longer looked like trenches, that sequence made the rest of the company's day look like luck to anyone who had not watched the pencil move across the pocket card all week. And when the light went, the same hands folded the same cards, came down the same ladders, and walked the tape in the dark, leaving modest signs, rags tied twice, a scratch at the first bend, that would become bearings and clicks at first light. The duel was no longer a contest of nerve. It had become a schedule written in inches and seconds, enforced by men who knew exactly how many of each they had to spend before breakfast. The craft settled into men as much as into manuals. Selection began with eyes and ended with temperament. A sergeant would stand a recruit 10 paces from a wall and point, not to a mark, but to a faint seam of mortar. He watched how long it took the gaze to find it, and whether the shoulders stayed still while the eyes worked. A second look came through glass, scope at low power, the reticles set on a coin of light, and the instructor watched for hunting. If the cross wires wandered, he sent the rifle down and started at the sling. Loop tension, butt in the same pocket, bone supporting muscle. The last test was simple. Wait. A man who could sit with a shutter closed, counting silently, and open it on the minute without looking at a watch was more valuable than the best shot who twitched. Sections formed around those habits. A typical battalion kept a small sniper scout observer group, 8 to 12 men, under an officer or senior NCO who could write as clearly as he could shoot. Pairing was constant. One on glass, one on rifle, roles traded before eyes tired. Reliefs were a clock, not a feeling. 2 hours forward, 1 back. Cellar slot in the morning, barn eve, afternoon. Armorers learned their rifles like names. Serials logged with notes on mounts that held 0, bells that stayed tight, screws that crept in wet. The section box looked like a toolkit. Gauze for objectives, soot or paint for bright edges, a hand drill and bit for saddening a too-clean hinge, a pouch of washers and screws that saved a day's work from being wasted by a loose ring. Discipline governed when to fire as much as how. A no-shoot period followed stand-to in many units while working parties reset wire and mended parapets under the narrow cover that periscope discipline and early morning mirage allowed. Harassing fire had its own schedule. 1 deliberate round at named minutes on a named slit, never enough to fix the firer's own location, always enough to keep the opposite parapet honest. The section leader carried 2 ledgers. The day's card of ranges and habits, and a program sheet that synchronized with trench mortars and field guns. The best days sounded like restraint. A shutter shattered at 7:08, a mortar set at 9:30 behind the 3rd traverse, a single round at 10:10. Return ceased. The quiet was a result, not an accident. The work adapted to rooms with new names and old problems. In hedged country, wind stacked itself in layers. The observer trusted the shimmer along the lane more than the branches above. In villages, light came hard off pale plaster. Windows promised death by silhouette, so slots were chipped under lintel and rifles fired through brick, not across panes. A mirror tucked below a sill borrowed sky into a suspected slit without giving their own back. Oil became a kind of speech in alleys. sweet depot scent drifting the wrong way gave a hideaway, so teams oiled lightly and, where choice allowed, kept their rifles upwind of their noses. Other fronts wrote footnotes to the same grammar. In the Alps, Austro-Hungarian and Italian marksmen read wind in snow banners and learned that thin air lengthened both the hold of a breath and the time a barrel took to cool. In Mesopotamia and Palestine, mirage went from hint to instrument. Long early shots belonged to the hour before heat made glass a rumor. Mud, brick, and palm offered apertures of a different color, but the rules held. No straight lines, no long looks, no second peeks after a gun lifted. In Salonika's hills, where lines were loose and patrols were roads, the scout in the pair mattered as much as the shot. Pace counts to a bend, bearings to a culvert, a sketch that could be read by a stranger. Countermeasures kept pace and were solved by timing, not bravado. German hardened core bullets arrived in quantity by 1917 and made short work of hinges and bolt heads at practicable ranges. Plates became invitations to better habits. Don't argue with steel. Change the conversation. Place a round through the opening at the instant a shutter lifts, or flatten the bank with a Stokes mortar and hand the problem back to shovel and bag. Periscopes kept their value only when handled with strict thrift. Never twice at the same height, never thrice at the same angle, never long enough to satisfy an opposite guess. In rain, lenses bloomed unless dressed. In cold, breath flagged if cheek met metal. In heat, barrels crept unless first light confirmation into buried steel said otherwise. None of this was dramatic. All of it kept a second from leaking away. The new American formations folded into the routine without ceremony. Springfields with prismatic sights, and sometimes other commercial tubes, joined British glass on the line. Range cards were drawn for a lieutenant with a map, not for pros. Logs were written for gunners who needed a minute and a grid, not a story. The Browning automatic rifle arrived late and added a specific tool, a short, tight bank of fire on command, into a suspected slit to buy precisely one breath. The rifle with glass still finished arguments. The automatic made the finish possible more often. Deception matured into craft. Forward boxes, pushed into shell holes under darkness and dressed at dawn to read as earth, regulated whole days from places a map would never show. In streets, a loophole through a chimney breast breathed less and showed less than any window. Dummies on rods, heads, and periscope tips still earned their keep when moved once in a broken rhythm to pull a test shot. After that, a dust plume marked a line on a card, and the day returned to work. Disguised steel trunks, the observation trees installed at night to replace sawn stumps, served more often for artillery eyes than rifles, but the principle belonged to everyone. Build the hide into the landscape, not onto it. The human accounting stayed blunt. Claims were proved with dull evidence. Shattered prisms, a plate hinge struck at a named minute, a mortar crater on a grid where a shutter had always flicked, and silence afterward recorded by two sets of eyes. Numbers for their own sake were discouraged. The ledger's purpose was to tell a company what lane could be crossed at 3 and which corner needed a mortar at 10 past, not to decorate a margin. Reliefs were kept by clock because stillness tired men faster than marches did. 2 hours forward, 1 back. Roles traded before the eyes dulled. A section chief who ignored that rule paid for it when a reticle hunted at the wrong breath. Psychology collected its own rules. Signs, keep your head down, were minutes made visible. Men learned to lift with knees, not backs, because silhouettes lengthened predictably. Steam from a mug was treated like sound. It carried above parapets and hedges in a way a patient eye could read. Sleeves rolled down even in heat, because a forearm was a straight line against dark earth. The fear in the scary seconds was not the shot itself, but the ordinary motion timed by someone who had already drawn a small triangle and was waiting for a minute hand. Coordination with guns became as tidy as any drill. Flash spotting and sound ranging parties, accustomed to triangulating batteries, occasionally took their art down to human scale. 2 crack-thump notes across a platoon frontage, a dust lift off a bolt head on the 3rd, an observer's time stamp, and a single 18-pounder round ended a week's nuisance. In return, snipers wrote range cards that traveled: grid, bearing, habit, time. So a captain who had never met them could act at once. When the front moved, the cards moved with it, folded into dispatch cases with air photographs that showed the same seams from above. By autumn, the craft ran in 2 speeds before lunch. A pair held a corner from a barn eave for 20 minutes so a company could turn a field. An hour later, they bolted a plate into a doorway on a newly won lane, wrapped glass and dulled edges, and began the quiet ledger that turned a chaotic street into a timetable. Shutter times, glints, the one slit that still flicked after breakfast. The rifles had not changed much since winter. The seconds had. They were saved in fractions over hours and spent whole in a single clean opening the day would allow. What did not change was the backbone. Periscope first. Plate lifted with the back of a glove. Reticles settled because it had been placed on a chalk dot inside the closed slit for half an hour. Breath stopped in the same place. Release, that felt like the same quiet word. Shutter down without watching the result. Kept intact in rooms that no longer looked like trenches, that sequence made the rest of the company's day look like luck to anyone who had not watched a pencil move across a pocket card all week. When dusk came, the same hands folded the same cards, climbed down the same ladders, and walked tape in the dark, leaving modest signs. Rags tied twice, a scratch at the first bend, that would become bearings and clicks at first light. The duel by then was less a contest than a schedule written in inches and seconds, enforced by men who knew exactly how many of each they had to spend before breakfast, and who had taught their units to live inside the silence they bought. Fatigue became part of the curriculum as surely as wind and range. A good section chief looked first for eyes that stayed steady, then for hands that moved only when they must. He paired men by temperament. One who could sit with a closed shutter and count silently to the minute. Another who could make a decision in the space of a single breath. And he rotated them by the clock, not by feel, 2 hours forward, 1 back. Roles traded before eyes dulled. Instructors had learned that stillness tired faster than marches. The ledger suffered before the shot did. Reticles began to hunt, periscope slivers stayed a heartbeat too long, and a pattern crept in where none could be afforded. Discipline showed in small, teachable acts. The shutter lifted with the back of a glove instead of fingertips, because a finger is a straight line the opposite eye seeks. The cheek never quite touched the plate in cold, because breath flagged the slit. The sling hole was pricked in the same sandbag, so the butt found the same pocket and the reticle settled without thought. Gauze sat a hand's breadth in front of the aperture to tame reflections the eye could not predict. The kit box looked ordinary. Gauze, soot, or paint to kill bright edges, a hand drill and bit for a sulking hinge, a pouch of washers and screws that saved a day's work from a loose ring, but it protected seconds the way a paymaster guards coin. Training grounds reflected the work. At the British First Army School, the stalking lane was a hollowed field set with false parapets and glass. Recruits crawled, counted, and learned to see a glint without showing one. Mirror patches below the trainee's sill borrowed squares of cloud into suspected slits. Dummies on rods moved only once, in broken rhythm, to pull a single test shot. Instructors timed exposures with stopwatches and spoke in sentences that could fit on a slate. Never twice the same height, never thrice the same angle. Never long enough to satisfy a guess. Canadian sections brought their own habits. Range cards written like a carpenter's plan, neat as shelves. And the Lovett Scouts' stalking craft, inherited from gamekeepers in an older war, reminded everyone that a hedge could hide a man better than any wall if the outline was broken and the shine killed. Villages and lanes demanded new ways to say old rules. Windows were promises to the opposite rifle. Slits were cut under lintels and rifles fired through brick rather than across light. A mirror laid below a sill borrowed sky into a suspected opening without offering one back. Oil became speech in streets. Depot scent drifting the wrong way betrayed a hide. Good teams oiled lightly, wiped thin, and, where choice allowed, kept their rifles upwind of their noses. In hedgerows, wind wrote in layers, low leaves twitching one way, high leaves another, so mirage along the lane decided the call even when branches disagreed. The duel stayed patient, even when the front moved. In the spring offensives, fog and short bombardments hid files of assault troops feeling for seams. Snipers worked as brakes and scouts. The observers whisper, "Now, wait, right side, wind dropped," mattered as much as the shot. A single deliberate round at the instant a head lifted to read a sign at a junction could hold a lane for 10 minutes, long enough for a platoon to find an edge. When ground went the other way in late summer, high corners tempted and experience refused them. Second stories behind shattered lintels, barn eaves with a good field, and the shadow under a gable offered minutes that could be spent. Air photographs reached company headquarters with a regularity few would have believed in 1915, and sniper cards nested under them naturally. Culvert east of Orchard, flicks 10 past, 25 past, penciled beside a pale seam a pilot had caught at noon. Mortars spoke on the minute. No one needed to lift a periscope for a last look. Rifles remained steady by design, not exotic. British SMLs and pattern 1914 rifles with Aldis or periscopic prism company tubes. Canadian Ross rifles that shot clean in trained hands. German Gewehr 98S with Zeiss or Gerds 3 times and 4 times optics on side mounts that left charges clear. American M19O 3 Springfields with Warner and Swazi prismatic sights, and where depots allowed, other commercial glass. Mounts kept iron sights usable. Bells were wrapped, objectives dulled. Face veils folded into the same pouch as the periscope. Ammunition lots stayed with rifles, so Zeros didn't wander for reasons no one at the plate could control. Familiarity shaved fractions from the one exposure that mattered. Armor and glass answered back and were met with timing, not bravado. Hardened core bullets that began to appear in quantity by 1917 scuffed bolt heads and tore hinges. Loophole plates became invitations to better habits. Aim at the opening and the instant the shutter moves, or flatten the bank with a Stokes mortar and give the problem to shovel and bag. Periscopes remained immunity only when handled with strict thrift. In rain, lenses bloomed unless dressed. In cold, breath flagged if cheek met metal. In heat, barrels crept unless a single round into buried plate proved point of impact at first light. None of this read like drama. All of it kept a second from leaking away. The ledgers made the work visible to strangers. A section leader carried 2 books, the card of ranges and habits, and a program sheet tied to trench mortars and field guns. An ordinary day in a quiet sector looked like this in pencil. Stand to complete. No change at Culvert east of Orchard. Periscope opposite, shattered 0715. Enemy mortar positioned 0935 behind 3rd Traverse. Single round 1010. Return ceased. Working party observed 14 OR5. Route altered to left side of bay. The quiet in between was a result, not an accident. It let men cross a lane at 3 and wash mugs at dusk without donating their silhouettes to an angle pre-sighted since breakfast. American battalions folded themselves into that grammar in months. Springfields with prismatic sights joined British glass on the line. Range cards were drawn for a lieutenant with a map, not for pros. Logs were written for gunners who needed a minute and a grid, not a story. The new automatic rifle in a squad poured a short bank of fire on command into a suspected slit and bought exactly 1 breath. The rifle with glass still finished arguments. Coordination with flash spotting and sound ranging parties, accustomed to triangulating batteries, occasionally came down to human scale. 2 crack-thump notes across a frontage, a dust lift off a bolt head on the 3rd. An observer's timestamp and a single 18-pounder round ended a week's nuisance. There were human calculations beyond ledgers. Reliefs were kept by clock because stillness dulled men faster than marches did. 2 hours forward, 1 back. Rolls traded before the eyes tired, yet sections learned to spot the signs early. A reticle that wandered, a periscope that lingered, a hand that lifted the shutter before the count reached the same number it had the day before. Ethical rumors traveled too, stories of rough handling for captured specialists, and men quietly stripped glass from rifles before moving rearward when orders came, because a bare stock looked like an ordinary weapon and a scope did not. None of it made the work less exact. It made it more so. Elsewhere, other fronts wrote their own footnotes to the same rules. In the Alps, the breath held longer and the barrel cooled slower. Wind read truer in snow banners than in grass. In Mesopotamia and Palestine, early light belonged to glass and the hours after to mirage. Mud brick and palm gave apertures of a different color, but windows were still traps and brick still a friend. On the Macedonian front, where patrols were roads as often as trenches, the scout in the pair mattered as much as the shot. Pace counts to a bend, bearings to a culvert, a sketch a stranger could act on. The grammar traveled because it was simple. Claims stayed dull by policy. Proofs were practical. A shattered prism retrieved, a hinge struck at a named minute, silence after a mortar crater on a grid where a shutter had always flicked, 2 sets of eyes to witness. Numbers for their own sake were discouraged. The ledger's purpose was to tell a company what lane could be crossed at 3 and which corner needed a bomb at 10 past, not to decorate a margin. Instructors wrote that lesson in the same plain hand they used for wind and range. Control beat show. By the last months, the craft ran at 2 speeds before noon. A pair held a corner from a barn eave for 20 minutes so a company could turn a field. An hour later, they bolted a plate into a doorway on a newly won lane, wrapped glass and dulled edges, and began the slow ledger that turned a chaotic street into a timetable. Shutter times, glints, the 1 slit that still flicked after breakfast. The rifles had not changed much since winter. The seconds had. They were saved in fractions and spent whole in the 1 clean opening the day allowed. The backbone remained intact where the rooms no longer looked like trenches. Periscope first, plate lifted with the back of a glove. Reticle settled because it had been placed on the chalk dot inside the closed slit for half an hour. Breath stopped in the same place. Release that felt like the same quiet word. Shutter down without watching the result. Kept this way, the sequence made luck look like planning for everyone behind the plate. On paper, it was only a line or 2, time, place, effect. But the men who wrote it knew what they had traded for those lines. The same seconds, bought each morning by habit that decided whether a day would be ordinary or not. Orders for the morning came down on paper that looked like any other. Stand to at first light. Working parties under cover when the nod came. Harassing fire only at named minutes. Liaison with trench mortars for a single round on a single slit. A section chief ran his thumb along yesterday's pencil lines. Culvert at 320 yards, shutter that flicked at 10 past and 25 past, and set his pair the way he always did. Periscope first, not the scope, a slow sector scan, a mark for anything that had shifted in the night. In the ruins ahead, fresh brick dust showed white on a sill. A damp stain crept under a shutter. A scuff at elbow height told where a runner always brushed the same corner. Inside the hide, the rifle lay already settled in a cut sandbag, sling hole pricked where yesterday's cheek had lived, a faint chalk dot on the inside face of the plate telling the reticle where to fall when the shutter lifted for a breath. The work had traveled to new rooms without changing its grammar. Hedges wrote wind in layers, low leaves twitching one way, high leaves another, so mirage along a rutted lane told the truth better than branches. In villages, light came hard off pale plaster. Scope bells wore gauze and soot, bright edges killed with a thumb. Windows remained promises to the opposite rifle. Slits were chipped under lintels and rounds sent through brick, not across empty panes. Mirrors tucked below sills borrowed small squares of sky into suspected openings without offering one back. Oil in alleys turned into a kind of speech. Depot scent drifting the wrong way betrayed a hide. Good teams oiled lightly, wiped thin, and sat upwind of their own rifles when they could choose. The ledgers grew more useful as the front loosened. Range cards were no longer neat fans tied to a straight parapet. They became patchwork. A bearing to the culvert under the road. Paces to the kink in a hedge. The thin triangle where two walls met that always drew a glance at the same minute after breakfast. The marks still spoke plainly. Grid when the map would take it, a sketch when the ground had no numbers to give. And the times turned habit into an appointment. A trench mortar sergeant could read that page without knowing the faces behind it. 2 bombs at 10 past the hour into the empty bay that hid a shutter, not because anyone saw a man there today, but because someone had seen one there every day and written it down. Fatigue had a chapter of its own. Stillness tired faster than marches. Sections rotated by clock. 2 hours forward, 1 back. Roles traded before the eyes dulled, and a chief learned to spot the slip before it cost a day. A reticle that wandered a finger's width before settling. A periscope that lingered a heartbeat too long. A hand that lifted the shutter a count early. The cure lived in small acts. The shutter came up on the back of a glove, not fingertips. In cold, the cheek never quite touched steel. The sling hole was the same hole in the same sandbag. Gauze sat a hand's breadth in front of the slit to tame reflections the eye could not predict. The kit box looked ordinary. Gauze, soot or paint to kill shine. A hand drill for a sulking hinge. Washers and screws to keep a ring from loosening. But it guarded seconds the way a paymaster guards coin. The spring offensives had shown how the craft worked when the line behaved like water. Fog and short bombardments hid files feeling for seams. Stormtroop parties moved by folds and nulls. Telephones went mute behind them. Snipers answered as breaks and scouts. The observer's whisper mattered as much as the shot. Now, wait. Right-hand corner. Wind dropped. One deliberate round at the instant a head lifted to read a sign at a junction could hold a lane for 10 minutes, long enough for a platoon to find an edge to stand on. When ground began to move back the other way, vantage tempted, church towers, factory shells, the last high corners, and experience refused. Second stories behind shattered lintels, Barn eaves with a field at the right distance. The long shadow under a gable offered minutes that could be spent. Air photographs reached company headquarters with a regularity few would have imagined in 1915, and sniper cards nested under them naturally. Culvert east of Orchard, flicks 10 past and 25 past, penciled beside the pale seam a pilot had caught at noon. Mortars spoke on the minute. No one needed a last look. Rifles stayed steady by design. British SMLEs and pattern 1914 rifles with Aldis or periscopic prism company tubes. Canadian Ross rifles that shot clean in trained hands. German Gewehr 98S with Zeiss or Gurts 3 times and 4 times glass on side mounts that left charges clear. American M19O, 3 Springfields with Warner and Swazi prismatic sights and where depots allowed, other commercial tubes. Mounts kept irons usable. Bells were wrapped, objectives dulled. Face veils folded with the periscope. Ammunition lots stayed with their rifles, so Zeros did not wander for reasons no one at the plate could control. Familiarity shaved fractions off the only exposure that mattered. Armor and glass answered and were met with timing, not bravado. Hardened core bullets scuffed bolt heads and tore hinges. Loophole plates turned into invitations to better habits. Aim at the opening and at the instant the shutter moved, or flatten the bank with a Stokes mortar and give the problem back to shovel and bag. Periscopes kept their safety only when handled with strict thrift, never twice at the same height, never thrice at the same angle, never long enough to satisfy an opposite guess. In rain, lenses bloomed unless dressed. In cold, breath flagged if cheek met metal. In heat, barrels crept unless a single round into buried plate proved point of impact at first light. None of it read like drama. All of it kept a second from leaking away. Claims and tallies stayed dull on purpose. Proofs were practical. A shattered prism retrieved, a hinge struck at a named minute, silence after a mortar crater on a grid where a shutter had always flicked. 2 sets of eyes to witness. Numbers for their own sake were discouraged. The ledger's purpose was to tell a company what lane could be crossed at 3 and which corner needed a bomb at 10 past, not to decorate a margin. The plainness was itself a mercy. It kept rivalry out of work that already asked enough of nerves. As autumn shortened the days, the section's 2 speeds often ran before noon. A pair held a corner from a barn eave for 20 minutes, so a company could turn a field. An hour later, they bolted a plate into a doorway on a newly won lane, wrapped glass and dulled edges, and began the quiet audit that turned a chaotic street into a timetable. Shutter times, glints, the one slit that still flicked after breakfast. The rifles had not changed since winter. The seconds had. They were saved in fractions and spent whole in the one clear opening the day would offer. The armistice arrived as most orders did, typed, posted, and read aloud. Ceasefire at the 11th hour of the 11th day. In more than one sector, the morning remained a work day until the clock reached it. Ledgers from 11th of November carry the same tone as any other. Stand to complete. No change at Culvert, east of Orchard. Single round at 0940. Return ceased. Working party observed 1005. Held until noon. Some units cut exposure entirely after 10. Others kept periscopes moving on the old rhythm until the minute passed. Along one canal, a patrol waited behind a slit until a hand on a wristwatch ticked to the hour, then walked into a street that did not answer back. Not every corner got the word at the same pace. In scattered places, rifles cracked late. Most of the line chose caution for a few more minutes, and then, gradually, ordinary speech. After the guns, the trade dissolved itself with the same economy it had used to live. Rifles were logged out, optics unbolted, serials matched to the pages that had tracked them. Mount screws that had been watched like heartbeat were counted into pouches. Gauze in soot, the small box with washers and a hand drill, the mirror that had borrowed squares of sky, all went back into crates. Loophole plates were pried from parapets and doorways. Some were stacked for salvage, others left to rust into the banks they had made safe. Periscopes were wrapped and marked. The ledgers were gathered and walked rearward. Many ended up as appendices to reports that used the same unadorned sentences to explain how a quiet habit had bought days. The writing did not end at the line. Instructors who had spoken on slates turned notes into formal guidance. The British officer who had shaped the First Army School published what he could in peacetime, preserving tricks that had been born out of necessity. Mirrors below sills to catch glint without giving it back. Dummy heads moved in broken rhythms, the right way to cut a slit under a lintel, and insisting, line after line, that control and brevity mattered more than any device. Other armies, reading their own after-action papers, kept the same rules under different covers: aim at places rather than faces, plot by crack thump and dust, never show a straight line, never open a slit twice the same way. The people went home at uneven speeds. Some took glass as souvenirs. Others left everything that shone behind. A few sections carried their ledgers to demobilization camps and, in borrowed offices, recopied the parts worth saving, the ranges to common things, the timings of shutters, the little sentences that had let working parties cross wire and runners use the left side of bays. Quartermasters made returns. Armorers wrote a last line beside serial numbers they knew by touch. In more than one notebook, the final entry looks like this: stand to complete, no change. Ceasefire, 1,100. Plates removed, 1,400. The craft's legacy scattered and condensed at once. Optical houses went on, making glass for peacetime uses. Instructors who had taught behind plates found their way to depots and interwar schools. Manuals tucked old rules into new covers. Where the next generation learned to shoot, the habits survived. No straight lines, no long looks, boards of smoke, not blankets. Short exposures counted in breaths. A rifle that did not surprise its owner because nothing around it was allowed to change. The plain language stayed too. It traveled because it was small enough to fit into anyone's pocket. Memory kept its own ledger. Letters home from those years mentioned the sound more than the strike. A single crack and then nothing. A habit corrected the next day by a sign nailed to duckboards. Keep your head down. Veterans spoke less about shots than about seconds. They remembered how mugs steamed above parapets and how sleeves looked against dark earth. How a plate lifted on the back of a glove and a breath was counted the same way each morning. The fear they named, when they named it at all, was not the enemy's rifle. It was the ordinary motion done at the wrong minute. By winter, the plates that had not been taken for salvage wore frost and silence. In places where hedges had been parapets, leaves moved in layers again, and no one wrote the motion down. The small tools, gauze on glass, soot on bright edges, a mirror under a sill, sat in crates or found new uses. The practice they had served did not vanish. It became, in notebooks and lectures, and the muscle memory of men who had counted aloud with a shutter closed, a short routine timed in breaths. On paper, it looks like nothing. A handful of seconds divided into smaller pieces. In the field, it was the difference between guesswork and a day that moved on schedule. The war ended the way a ledger ends, with a last line written in the same hand as all the others. Plates were unbolted, mirrors wrapped, rifles logged out by serial. A few hours later, The men who had measured mornings in seconds were on roads that ran away from the front, moving at the walking pace of columns, their pocket cards folded flat. The craft they carried did not evaporate with the smoke. It condensed into notes, into lectures, into plain sentences that could survive peace. Those sentences were already on paper. The British First Army School had kept the clearest ones, and after the armistice, its instructors turned board work into guidance. Never show a straight line, never look twice the same way. Build the hide into the ground, not onto it. Aim at places rather than faces. Write range cards other people can use. Hesketh Pritchard published his lessons and preserved the useful tricks, mirrors below a sill to catch a glint without giving one back, double loopholes that stole a test shot, slabs of gauze in front of a slit to kill reflections the eye could not predict. Across other armies, the same truths reappeared with different headings. German manuals that had grown out of hunting culture kept the discipline of pairing and patience. French and Canadian notes stressed range cards and the habit of timing shutters. Americans carried home instruction sheets that treated a sniper's log as a tool for artillery rather than a diary. The equipment passed into peacetime with fewer scars than the men. Optical firms went back to civilian glass with a better understanding of seals, mounts, and how sunlight behaves. Rifles, SMLs, pattern 1914S, Gewehr 98s, M19O. 3 Springfields, Rosses, returned to stores with chalk marks in their books about which mount held 0, which ring crept, which sling stud had stretched. Ammunition tables kept the war's newer shapes, Spitzer bullets, flatter flight, the reminder that a 0 is a promise that must be reproved each morning. Even the armor that once comforted, steel loophole plates, left behind an idea more valuable than the metal. Don't argue with the thing your enemy is ready for. Change the conversation. Units disbanded, habits did not. The periscope discipline drilled for years, never the same height twice, never the same angle 3 times, survived in range huts and on small bore lines. Range cards followed police marksmen into rooftops and instructors into lecture rooms. The quiet geometry of crack, thump, and dust lived on in artillery batteries that had learned to trust a 2-line note from a trench more than a paragraph from a headquarters. And everywhere the same plain safety survived in stenciled words a recruit could understand. Keep your head down. Memory tried to turn the work into stories with clean edges. The ledgers refused. They insisted on context. A shattered prism placed on a table, a hinge struck at a named minute, a mortar crater where a shutter had always flicked, silence after, witnessed by 2 sets of eyes. Numbers for their own sake, totals written large, were discouraged in life and proved unreliable in retrospect. What mattered then, and holds up now, was whether a lane could be crossed at 3 in the afternoon, whether a runner used the left side of the bay, whether a working party came back with all its men because someone had spent a forenoon writing down shutters. The men who did that work went home by timetables as ordinary as their reports. Some took a bit of glass as a souvenir. Most left anything that shone. A few carried ledgers to demobilization offices and recopied what ought to be kept. Distances to common things. Timings that were always true until they weren't. The small sentences that turned guesswork into clocks. Armorers closed books beside serial numbers they knew by touch. Quartermasters counted out the last washers from the pouch that had kept mounts tight. The final entries are simple because simplicity is what the craft had always asked for. Stand to complete. No change. Plates removed 1400. What lasted longest were the rhythms. Even detached from trenches and saps and traverses, they fit wherever a life might be saved by a breath measured and a movement shortened. Instructors found ways to teach them without the mud. Place the rifle so the reticle doesn't hunt when you open the shutter. Settle at the natural pause of the breath. Move only the part that must move. Break contact with the moment the instant the work is done. In other words, make seconds yours before you spend them. And the routine that the best British schools timed with stopwatches, the one sergeants could recite in a sentence and privates could do in their sleep, survived entire. It was not a trick. It was a promise to yourself, measured in 5 quiet beats. Prepare behind the plate. Rifle already rested, sling tension set, cheek weld remembered, reticle held on the chalk dot inside the closed slit. No searching to do once it opens. Take the breath you can repeat. Exhale to the natural pause. Do not hold strain. Let the sight picture settle where it always settles. Lift with the back of the glove. 1/2 inch is enough. No fingers, no straight lines, no flourish. Confirm without hunting and release. The reticle should already be on the exact patch of daylight you meant to own. If it isn't, close. If it is, the pressure travels straight back. No snatch, no second look. Shutter down at once. The exposure, from lift to drop, stays inside 5 seconds and is better inside 3. The count is out loud in training, silent in work. Instructors enforced that rhythm because it turned nerves into timing and timing into control. It made a duel less a contest of nerve and more a drill that refused to waste a breath. And when the front was quiet, it let other people live on a schedule they could trust. There are grander ways to tell this history. The ledgers prefer smaller words. They show a craft that began as improvisation and ended as a language. Glass before rifle. Boards of smoke, not blankets. Mirrors for glint. Slits under lintels. Aim at habits. Write what others can use. Measure, then move. They show how a day could be made ordinary on ground designed to make it otherwise. And they hold to a truth that outlasted the map lines. The scary part was never the shot. It was the second before it, one in training, kept by discipline, spent so carefully that a company could walk through it and make it to dusk with nothing more dramatic to report than no change.